You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. We're back at Hotel Pacifico with Geoff and Mike together for this special episode. Thanks for joining us, Geoff, for this one.
My pleasure.
So, listeners, I have an ask because these two gentlemen, you'd be surprised to know how closely they follow our reviews online and on Apple Podcasts. They are hounds for 5-star reviews, and they take it really personally when we go too long without it. So out of compassion for Mike and Geoff listeners, if you could find it in your hearts to go online and give us a review, we'll take 3 and 4-star reviews too, but it's really the 5.
No, we won't. We'll take 5.
Only 5.
Don't quit.
Only 5. Don't
So
quit.
I have a frequent listener. We won't say his real name. Let's just call him BC.
Is it your daughter?
And he sends me texts and I say, give me a 5-star review. He says, is that on Yelp? No, it's not on Yelp.
TripAdvisor?
Wherever you get your podcasts. And a
Yes.
shout out to our YouTube listeners, our watchers as well. We have one frequent commenter on there. I believe he goes under the handle Griff. Thanks for watching. I see that you have a comment every week. Don't always agree with what you're hearing, but that's good. That's why we want your comments.
We're glad. Yeah, any suggestions for what folks can offer up in their comments? Like, do we need some inspiration? Right?
Spice it up.
Mhm.
Spice it up. The best nonpartisan pillow-mints in town.
Suggestions for guests, always welcome.
Oh, that too.
Mhm.
No vacancies for spin. We'll take all your hotel references, your suggestions, your feedback. Thanks, listeners.
Help Kate with her hotel metaphors. That'd be
Oh,
good.
I love the hotel metaphors. More, please.
I have a hotel story.
Okay.
Is our guest crashing
I know.
the
Why
intro?
don't
She's just like coming into the lobby strong.
It's like she's in opposition, standing up, demanding time from the
Well,
speaker.
we should
Should
let
we
her.
introduce her first?
Yeah, maybe we should introduce her to our guests. Just let her know, because today there's no strategy suite. Just with us, because we're skipping that. We're going to go straight to the premier suite for today's episode with someone who your voice, you probably already recognized her voice, the 35th premier of BC, Christy Clark. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Very nice to be here with you guys. Thank you. I
Now-
was checking out of the Tower Inn. Mike knows this story. In Quesnel, and we were up there for a caucus retreat, and we were in opposition. And the NDP had just been up there too. So the premier had been, we were all campaigning really hard. It must have been I guess it was early 2000, late 1999 or something. Anyway. And so Glenn Clark had been up there with his caucus, and me and Patty Sahota, our friend, Mike's and I friend, who recently tragically passed away, are checking out of the Tower Inn. And the guy at the front desk, he says, Miss Clark, Miss Sahota, it's so nice to see you guys here in Quesnel. You know that your dads were just here. And we look at each other and I'm thinking, my dad wasn't just, and then we realize, oh, they think our dads are Mo Sahota and Glenn Clark. And Geoff, I told Glenn Clark that story one time, and he was so upset. He was like, no one would ever think that you're young enough to be my daughter.
He blamed it on the Mike McDonald government.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Christy, Madam Premier Emeritus.
Premier Emeritus, I like that.
Yeah, where do we find you today?
New York. I'm in Manhattan,
Ooh.
watching my son perform.
Oh, fantastic. Is that already happened, or is that about to happen?
It happened yesterday, but then I have to head to Ottawa to do a speech on Thursday, and then I'm going to the Prime Minister's funeral on Saturday. So I'm staying here for a couple of days and going to see a few Broadway shows while I'm here.
Oh, yeah, nice. Yeah,
Agreed.
is that what? Go ahead.
Great place to be and a great reason to be there.
Yeah, it is, Geoff. Thanks. Yeah.
Any recommendations? I hear you're up on the Broadway beat. Any recommendations for shows for folks?
Well, the one you can't get a ticket to is the Michael Jackson, not MJ, Michael R. Jackson, teeth. Can't get a ticket to that.
Mm.
Apparently, well, there'll be a couple that are closing soon, but Sweeney Todd, which has had Josh Groban in it, unbelievable performance. So if you're a Sondheim fan, I mean, of course you love Sweeney Todd, dark, weird, everything. Josh Groban is amazing in it. The female lead, whose name I forget, is unbelievably funny. And it's the first time that this Sondheim show has been mounted with a full orchestra since 1973 or something, when it was first produced. So strongly recommend Sweeney Todd if you're here.
So is that when you're going to see, or is that?
No, we saw it around Christmas.
Okay, so this is like a regular thing for you. You are like making the rounds on Broadway in New York, like with some frequency.
Well, I mean, Hamish has lived in Chicago, going to university down at Northwestern. So I've been back and forth a bit.
Is this the kid that was born when you were cabinet minister and he had a crib in the legislature? Is that the same kid you're talking about?
That guy. Yeah, that little guy. Yeah, 22 years old now.
He grew up.
He sure did. I remember everybody passing him around in the legislature, just holding him when he was, because little babies are so special, right? When they're so fresh. And I just remember it was kind of like everybody wanted to hold him, and it was a very nonpartisan thing,
So what do you remember about then too? Like, I think at the time, were you the second woman to have a baby in cabinet in Canada? Is that right? Yeah. So,
Yes.
and watching sort of, I think some of the more recent women who've had babies while holding a cabinet position, do you feel like it's changed a lot in terms of how people, basically the support that's there and the understanding that's there for women who have babies in office?
Yes, I do. I think it's better, not where it should be. It's great that a daycare is opening up in the legislature. I mean, I do think parliamentarians should always worry about how far ahead the benefits for parliamentarians get from, people in the private sector. I think we should always be thinking about that, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have one in the legislature. It is so hard to be a mother with a brand new baby and you're nursing in the legislature if you don't have some care for them. So, Kate, when I was there with Hamish, we ended up hiring a nanny, another woman and I who worked there, who just had a baby as well. They were just almost the same age. And we took over an old empty kind of an office space that had actually been allocated to me as education minister. It was across the hall. And we just set up in there and used that as the nursery for them. So it was super, super convenient, but it was the only way I could have done it. I don't know how you would do it without doing that. And, if you're an MLA and you're earning like 120 grand a year, I don't know how much they earn now, but, so your take home pay is say 70 grand. It is really tough to pay for a nanny.
Yeah.
Unless you combine, the care with other people's children. So I think it's a great thing that's happening. But I remember when I got that office across the hall, which we were going to use anyway, it was like the photocopying room.
Yeah.
Ed, what's his name at CTV did this whole story about how we were using taxpayers' money to support. And it's like, well, what taxpayers' money? Well, it's heated and lit and paid by the taxpayers.
Oh, wow. Because otherwise it'd be a cold, barren den, and the taxpayers, the money would be.
I mean, it's in the legislature. They don't unheat rooms in the legislature.
Exactly.
Except the ladies' washroom is very cold, but
The nanny wasn't the caucus whip by any chance? No.
No, but definitely not. Anyway, my point is that the media are, I think, treated a little bit differently now than they did then. I think even Jenny Kwan, and it was just out of partisanship, criticized it, back in the day. No one would do that now. But nonetheless, it is still, it's a big task. But I think the task is as big for women in the legislature now as it is for women in workplaces everywhere. Right?
Well, I was going to say on your point about the nanny too, it's interesting. Childcare is incredibly difficult to afford. It's better these days, but it's on the right trajectory, but hard to afford. And it is kind of typically a 7:45 to 5:30 type arrangement, which is not the MLA job description or the cabinet minister or premier job description. Like I don't know how you would do that without some kind of supplemental care family nanny at all.
Well, you hope like hell that your kid's going to sleep at 5:30 when the
Was-
nanny leaves, which is what we did. And then you also have staff who like your kid.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
That's
With
the
him,
only way to do it is the kid moves. I mean, if you're sitting past 5 o'clock, that's your job.
Well, Christy,
Yeah.
you're celebrating a happy ending as your son graduates, but wasn't the separation as he was older just as tough as taking care of them at the legislature when you were there? That's what I've observed, is how tough it is on families when they're separated from their kids for so long, or for elected officials face that all the way through the career.
Yeah, it's true. It really is. Although, you know, Jeff, maybe that's kind of the male side of it, right? Like the male curse in life is often to be away from your kids a lot more than the women in the household are, than the mother typically traditionally is. So I don't know. I mean, you'd have to answer this for me, but I don't know if men would feel that differently, because in a traditional workplace for men, that's what happens in the world. You're away from 9 to 5 all day. You don't see your kids. You're maybe not dropping them off at school and, you know, picking them up after class. So for women though, yeah. I mean, the thing that is really a problem is the nursing, to be
Mhm.
honest, because
Mhm.
you just can't not be there if you're nursing your child. And if you're trying to do it till they're 2 years, which, you know, I think many women aspire to, we don't all make it, then it's a very difficult 2 years. But it's a hard job. Like these MLAs give up so much of their family time because the hours are so weird and you're traveling all the time.
So this
Well-
relates really nicely to a question, actually. So when I was preparing for this interview, I reached out to a mutual friend of ours, Christy, Kathleen Wynne, to
Mm.
ask her, you know, to say I'm talking to Christy tomorrow, and sort of what would you ask Christy if you were talking to her? She says hi, by the way. And she went back to a photo that is burned into my memory, right? It's a photo from the Council of the Federation when there were 6 of the 13 premiers were
Mhm.
women. I'm trying to think how old I was. I was probably a new mom when that photo was taken, and it felt really meaningful to me. And so she was going back to that, reflecting on a conversation the two of you had actually about commentary on social media. And so Kathleen's take, and Kathleen is very open about this. So Kathleen spent a lot of time reading comments in social media. Her kind of, for those listening,
Not healthy.
there was a beautiful eye roll from Christy on this. Well, and Kathleen's kind of, will say, like, I'm not sure, like, I don't agree with Christy's approach, but I think there's a great argument for it. So Kathleen's approach is sort of like, I need to read it because I need to understand. I have to have not even thick skin, porous skin, because I can't take it in, but I've got to understand. And she was saying one of the things she found really interesting about you and a conversation you had at this Council of the Federation was you explaining why you don't. Can you tell us the thinking there?
Yeah, well, it's just, I mean, it's like standing in a grocery store and having some guy stand there yelling at you right in your face. What are you going to do? Are you going to yell back, or are you going to just walk away? You know,
is there an argument on social media though? Because you're like, they're not yelling at you. You're just like, you're on your phone or you're on your computer, you're safe. Is there a case to be made that you can understand and kind of keep a pulse on what people are saying about you?
No. Well, there is an argument for that for sure, but it doesn't outweigh the harm that it does, because it feels like yelling. Like the stuff that people would say about Kathleen Wynne was like, it was awful. Like, I mean, the stuff they said about me was awful too, sexist and horrible. But in her case, you add, the whole anti-gay stuff. It was just terrible, the things they would say. I don't know why anybody would want to consume that kind of hatred. But my take on it, the way I dealt with it was the way I would deal with somebody who yells at me in the grocery store or who gives me the finger when they're driving by or whatever, is to think to myself, something is going on inside that person that makes them like so angry at the world that they would yell at a little old lady or a random person and then try to actually feel some empathy for them for being so sad, so angry. I mean, you can't always get there with it, but I never wanted to allow those people who were angry at me to dump their ugliness into my lap and have it sit there and burn a hole in me. because that's what they're trying to do. I think when people are yelling and screaming and insulting, they are just trying to contaminate you with their ugliness. And my choice was to not consume it so that they couldn't. Because I'm an optimist and I wanted to stay an optimist.
Well, I think that's what Kathleen would say. Like, I think her reaction was, she was saying this, like, I don't agree with Christy on this, but I have to say it really took, I think for my mental health, her approach probably would have been better. And I'm listening to you and there's a kind of emotional efficiency to what you're describing.
Oh,
Yeah, I see it. I don't know. And I think knowing Kathleen a bit, I feel like I also might fall into this trap a little bit. Like, it's really hard. I think it takes a lot of discipline to do that though, too. It's
well,
really hard to not want to know. Yeah.
So Kate, I don't know you very well, but here's my guess about you and Kathleen is that you are both those young girls in school who always had to get an A in class, and you had to be perfect, and you had to get, like, you had to know you were perfect. You see, I have not suffered from that. I'm just like,
I'm feeling naked right now. Like, I'm feeling this is a little bit okay. Yeah, just
I don't
going.
even remember you ever going to class in the university anyways.
I love that.
There you go.
Yeah,
there you
yeah,
go.
yeah. No,
So-
I'm gonna call Kathleen later and we'll commiserate because I feel like you've seen us a bit, and it's a really interesting point. And it's also, I think, to some degree, it's the role of your staff to like kind of like sum that up for you and make sure you know what you need to know, because increasingly it's just becoming hard to read those comments. Related to that, I'm wondering, like, now, like, how many years out are you? 8 years? 8 years out?
From primer.
Yeah. 7. When, oh yeah, 2024. So when you get recognized by people and they approach you, what's the most common thing they bring up about your premiership?
Okay, I'm going to contextualize this. Everybody I meet now who recognizes me always is a supporter. It's just that because people who hated you or they're over it now. They hate somebody else. They've moved on, so they're a lot less likely to say anything. So people stop me fairly frequently, and they just, they generally just say, we want you back. We want you to come back. We miss you. And people are really nice about it. So, just to contextualize that, because it's a certain group of people. And generally what they say is they're people who care about economic growth. They like the energy industry. They're concerned about their jobs and their paychecks and, that sort of thing, right? Those kinds of people who are I think they're kind of looking for good, competent management sort of people, The other thing though, that people seem to remember about me is that I was, I tried to be pretty positive and optimistic about the world most of the time. I always kind of had a view that, things were going pretty well and we could make it go better. And I think one of the things that people are missing in Canada now is a sense of optimism in general. And a lot of that's driven by the incredible divisiveness and anger, like we just talked about, Kate, that you see in the political landscape. So I think Canada's very disunified now as a result. People are angry as a result, and optimism has paid the price. It's all got taken a back seat. And I'm not going to say that that's happened just since Poilievre got elected. I think that's a longer term problem that Canada's had.
I mean, you've attended some events. I'm trying to remember the name of the group, Center Ice, I think it's called, which was about finding a more moderate space in federal politics. You'd said some positive things about Jean Charest in the past, and you in an earlier day had worked under the administration of Jean Chrétien, and those brand of leaders seem to be, not in fashion right now federally.
Yeah.
Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I do. And I regret it. I think, those men, and they were all men you've named, and I would include Byron Mulroney in it, were people who believed in unifying the country. All of them talked about unifying the country. And I think the problem that, the perennial problem that Canada has is that we are so disparate. we are people like, Quebecers don't understand BC really. British Columbians don't necessarily understand Newfoundland, or, and Ontario doesn't understand Alberta. Like there isn't, I mean, come to the States and people are so mobile here. Well, my son lives in North Carolina. My daughter goes to UCLA, and, we live in Seattle, and they're moving around all the time. Canadians, I don't think, understand the country intuitively, and we don't have as many symbols that unite us. We didn't have a Revolutionary War. We don't have this big constitution that we fight about all the time. We don't have all of these, these pillars of history like Lincoln and Washington and John Kennedy. So there aren't those symbols that really unite us. And my view is always the Prime Minister is the single most important job they have is to talk about what brings us together. And nobody's doing that now. In fact, I think they're setting the provinces against each other. So I think it's a huge problem for us. And that flows down to our economic growth. It flows down to coordination between the provinces. Ultimately, I think it's could be a disaster for Canada. But that's what I liked about all those guys. They were coalition builders in so many ways within their own parties. They were broad-based parties, and then across the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about coalitions since you brought it up. At the federal level, sure, yeah. To be successful in federal politics, you got to knit together a lot of different groups, different regions, different language groups, and it's challenging to hold it together. But let's go straight to British Columbia. As Premier, you inherited a party that was low in the polls at the end of Gordon Campbell's tenure, when the HST had damaged the party, and you were coming in perceived as a liberal, and a lot of conservatives weren't sure about you, and you had a task at hand to try to re-energize the coalition, keep everybody in one place, because there was a potential vote split with the BC Conservatives at that time. So what was your approach? How did you philosophically approach that, going into that challenge?
There were two, well, there was sort of the philosophical approach to it, which was reminding everybody what the BC Liberals were about, which was, look, I used to say to people, okay, I know you're anti-abortion, or in some cases, I know you're pro-capital punishment. You can believe it. Anyway, like that long kind of broad list of things that divide us. We are leaving that at the door here, folks. Can we just focus on economic growth? Can we just focus on creating jobs for British Columbia, a more prosperous future, looking after the things that people expect us to look after, and then we'll have the money that we can, to pay for healthcare and education and all those things that knit us together. So let's just focus on that. And, Mike, people were pretty good in our caucus about focusing on that. Actually, there were three things. So there was that. Second, there were all of the people who hated Gordon Campbell because he'd never put them in cabinet, who liked me for about 5 minutes after I became leader because they thought I was going to put them in cabinet. Then it turned out that most of the people that Gordon Campbell had in his cabinet were the right people. So they didn't make it into cabinet. So I wasn't very with my own caucus that Gordon had left me for very long. So there was that whole internal kind of just the pure politics of how do you keep people on side. And I remember, you remember this, I would stand in front of caucus every day before question period, and I would say, okay, look, I've counted out the number of question periods we have until we get to a break. And that's only 15 minutes a day. So it was before it extended to half an hour. So, let's just behave ourselves today. Like just today, let's just get through today. And to the whole caucus to try and keep every single day I would do that we had question period. And we'd sort of somehow held it together while some members of the caucus were texting the Globe and Mail from inside the caucus room about what was actually happening. I mean, you got them from John, I'm sure, Kate, and other names I won't mention. But anyway.
Don't name sources.
Not that I remember. And the third thing, though, about it was we were working full-time in my office, as you remember, Mike, keeping the caucus on side. Like, it was that caucus management thing, Peter Lougheed was the master of it, and his words about it, you know, he said, the most important audience you have is your caucus, because if you can't keep them there, you can't win.
Can we imagine a fiction though? Can we imagine that scenario in the pandemic? Because I think some of what is this moment is a little bit of that division over vaccine mandates and everything else. And so I guess what I'm asking is, maybe, do you have a bit of sympathy for Kevin Falcon, particularly in this moment, in sort of how this moment in time has really exacerbated or created new opportunities for Cleves?
Yes, it has, for sure. However, Kate, we worked so hard. Like, I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that work happening in BC. I don't think it happened to the extent that it needed to in Alberta for Premier Kenney either. Like, we spent so much time, like, we knew who was vacationing with whom in the caucus. I remember one time we asked someone not to go on vacation with somebody because they were a caucus rebel. Okay.
Oh,
like we were
bad caucus influence.
We were on it. And then in addition to that, we were on the phone constantly to Reform Party members in BC, Conservative Party members in BC, bringing them on side, holding meetings. Like, you couldn't believe the effort that we put in to hold that coalition together. And our job was to keep the Conservatives under 5%, because Geoff will tell you we couldn't win if it was over 5%. So we did it, but it wasn't like, it didn't happen by magic. It was just elbow grease and dumb, stupid, brute force, really. Hey, Mike?
I completely agree with your emphasis on that, Christy. So looking at the current situation of the Free Enterprise Coalition, was it foreseeable and preventable, or were there underground kind of factors that you mentioned at the national level that maybe have caused this rift?
I think it's both, Geoff. I think it's an insightful question. I think first, there was I'm not sure that the changing the party name was a great idea, because the BC Liberals have to get federal Liberal votes in order to win. And so when you say, well, we're taking your name off the banner, it isn't really a welcome sign to come vote for you. So there's that for sure. But also, absolutely, Justin Trudeau has, pulled the Liberal Party, federal Liberal Party, very, very significantly to the left. And he's taken a lot of federal Liberal voters with him. I don't think it's a permanent home for them, but I don't even really recognize lots of I don't think Mr. Chrétien would recognize much of the stuff that that Mr. Trudeau talks about these days. And
if I could follow up briefly, I was struck by your comment, because some of the criticisms of what the right calls the woke aspect of left politics, I would agree is problematic for broad voter appeal, and we see the statues coming down and so on. You talked, I thought, really compellingly about national symbols being kind of absent here. Has the federal Liberal Party drifted into a bit of that territory where the message sounds negative to average voters as opposed to a positive and optimistic one?
Yeah, I think it is it's a kind of an ongoing negative commentary about who we are. We're just not good enough. We're just not getting it right. We've got to work harder. And every minute you have to communicate something, you're not communicating something else. So I think that's absolutely true. I think, though, too, also that people often seem to think that, if you're talking about doing all of those things and policing behavior and all that stuff, when are you talking about my life? Like, when are you talking about my economic future and how much money I have in my wallet when I get my paycheck? And that there sort of seems to be a whole dialogue that no one is talking about except now the Conservatives, but I think coming out of the federal Liberals. And I do think that we've had an era of abundance for so long, Geoff, that people have we've kind of had it really good. And it's only when you can recently remember the harder times that you really start to get focused on how to make sure they never come again. But I think that time is coming back. I do.
I'll leave it to someone else to ask the debt and deficit question that we talked about before the show.
Okay.
I'll ask it. We've had a kind of almost like a running joke on this podcast about the surplus of 2017, where I have meekly, or some would say bravely, defended the fiscal
Tomato,
rectitude
tomato.
of the BC Liberal government, that the surplus was a demonstration of our principle.
And Geoff thinks it was
Wow.
a gift to the NDP. We're stupid.
Well,
Yes.
Glenn Clark,
Yes, heard
Bob
us.
Dewar, John Horgan,
Pretty
are all very
consistently.
grateful, very grateful.
Yep, political
But-
staff got tired of hearing my lectures on this point. Remember
And,
these days.
Don Wright said that Mike DeYoung held taxpayers' dollars hostage, which is probably pretty accurate. But the fact of the matter is that the finances were very robust in your administration. It didn't start out that way. You had to bend it to balance, and then the surpluses started to rack up, and you're on the way to paying off the operating debt. And now, that Mike DeYoung's point was that helped. He's proud that it helped government get through COVID because the balance sheet was so strong. And now we're at a stage today with the latest budget from David Eby that it's actually, I think, many observers will say it's surprisingly high deficit, and the debt is starting to pile up again.
The biggest debt in history.
Yeah. So do you think that, do you think voters care? I think there's a conventional wisdom coming out of COVID that voters don't care about deficits and debt right now.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I know leaders should care about that. I mean, maybe voters don't, but leaders should. And like I don't really understand that. I don't really understand the question, Mike. However, here's what I'll say.
It wasn't really a question.
Well,
Just
isn't
talk
there
about
something-
that deficit.
Well, isn't
I
there
hear-
something? There's something to pull apart in that, though. I think there's something to pull. Like, yes,
Okay,
they have to care
can
about
I?
it.
So can I just
go? Yeah, yeah.
speak to it quickly though, which is
Yeah.
to say, you can think of it as a dumb political gift to the NDP, but I think it is wrong to govern as though you should not do the right thing just in case you don't get reelected. I think that is just the antithesis of good government. So if I have a regret about it, it's that, I mean, we could have put it into infrastructure for sure. We could have spent all of it on infrastructure. We could have spent all of it on tax cuts, which I actually think would have been fantastic. But both of those things increase your inflation rate, which also has an impact on people. Like none of these things are value neutral, right? So, our economy was already the fastest growing in Canada. We had the best job numbers in Canada. We were killing it on every metric. We didn't really need to cut taxes more, but if we really wanted to electrify the election, we would have, and this is a purely political, point, we would have cut taxes dramatically. That would have been kind of the political thing to do, but it doesn't actually, and in retrospect, probably we should have, but it doesn't make it the right public policy thing to do. And I just don't think, I think it's so cynical for anybody to argue that, oh, gee, ha, 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 stupid you guys had left us with all this money that we could just go spend like idiots. Like what kind of an argument for government is that?
So you went exactly where I was going to go, because I think
I knew it, and I didn't want you to say it first. Kate.
Well, you said it so well, so it's all good. But I'm gonna disagree with you on some parts of it, because I think like the point that I think is important, and this is where I think BC is really interesting, because the point of this that is important is we become really fixated on this question of, is it red? Is it black? What's the size? And I'm not saying that that's important. And I think what you've articulated too is like, it's actually more like, is it red? Is it black? Why? What are you spending on? What are you not spending on? What are you doing on the tax, the revenue side as well? Like I worry that with the electorate, we distill this argument to a sort of, red, black number, when in fact, there's so much more to talk about. And it's interesting. I wanted to ask you if you see a difference in how BC treats, or how maybe the leadership of BC are treated compared to what Ottawa does, right? Because Ottawa can run large deficits and the headlines are so much about what they're spending on, right? It's a very different thing. And I would say Doug Ford in Ontario has also been running consecutive deficits, and the discussion is way more about what they're doing with the money. In BC, we pretty consistently seem to be focused on on narrowing the discussion a bit. Does that seem true to you? Yeah.
Narrowing it to say,
What's the number? Is it red? Is it black? not enough discussion on the like, why is it red? Why is it black? What are we spending on? What are we doing on the revenue side? Like it feels we're hyper focused on that number compared to certainly Ontario and Ottawa, or certainly
Yeah, well,
Toronto and Ottawa. Yeah.
maybe we need a better press gallery.
Oh, ouch.
Well, I mean, no,
Yeah.
but seriously, like if that's how that's where the reporting is generated, right? I mean, it's not like, it's not like the NDP is covering up these numbers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although there was that little Clean BC scandal, but anyway, that's a whole different
Little thing.
thing.
Yeah.
But it's not as though government is trying to hide these numbers. It's not like government is, government can put a spin on it, but it really is up to the media to interpret those numbers. And I think, I really do think that is a lack of kind of digging on the part of folks that are supposed to be uncovering this stuff. But, BC's always been a more partisan place than the rest of the country, right? It's always been left versus right, black versus white, labor versus management, all that stuff. But, you would think we would have left some of that behind because we've become such a much more diverse population and economy since those sort of early days that shaped us. Perhaps that's still what's shaping us. But I also think that women get different coverage of the way that they govern.
Yes.
And it's not just sort of outwardly sexist, although there's plenty of that analysis of your hair and your, the length of your skirt. But, I look at Danielle Smith and I and kind of what she's doing in Alberta, and the coverage is a little bit like the coverage I felt I got in some ways, in as much as the ideas that she comes up with are way more likely to be treated as just sort of crazy and undoable. And there's sort of always this suspicion that she's a nut, that these are dumb ideas. And I think almost all the ideas I ever talked about with, kind of were translated as, that's dumb. That's crazy. You can never do LNG in British Columbia. You could never create all those jobs in British Columbia. You could never have, 5 LNG plants, blah, blah. Like it was all treated as just as though it was crazy. And the opposition will do that. But the media's appetite for accepting that narrative about women, they have a bigger appetite for accepting that narrative about women than they do about men.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a dynamic in finance where you talk about the probability of being approved for a loan, particularly as a business leader, a small business leader. And women are about twice as likely, if I'm up to date on my data, to be turned down as men. No particular reason, aside from the fact that they're women. And the interesting thing is, in terms of perceptions, business leaders tend to be perceived as, if they're leveraging a business, they're spending too much. If men are leveraging a business, they're strategic, they're visionary, right? And I think the same thing applies to a premier leading a budget, that your spending decisions are put through an entirely different lens. And same thing with, and then I think you can extend it a bit to like when you're innovating. Are you innovative? Are you pushing the envelope, or are you crazy?
Yeah.
I was crawling in traffic across the Ironworkers last week, reflecting on the fact that for most of my childhood, I'd known the number one cause of traffic slowdowns to be wildlife. Don't get the wrong impression. I grew up in southwestern Ontario, so most often it was wild turkeys. But certainly, there are a breadth of different challenges that exist to infrastructure in urban areas compared to rural and remote ones. And whether you live in a place where you plan your route to avoid rush hour or moose, there's one piece of infrastructure that has become increasingly essential over time and across geographies: access to high-speed internet. That's why TELUS has been working in partnership with government funders to expand access to the Pure Fibre network across BC's north. Pure Fibre is BC's only 100% pure fibre to the home network. It currently reaches more than 1.7 million homes and businesses across the province, including 269,000 rural ones. An economic impact study conducted by BC Stats shows that BC's northern region experienced a boost of 2.2 million in GDP, along with the creation of 195 new jobs and 1.3 million in municipal tax revenue during the construction phase of connectivity projects. That's an initial provincial investment of 38.4 million that has generated 269.4 million in benefits for the northern region and a 7-fold return on investment. It's a boon for business owners like Doug Olson, a member of the Laidley Tenay First Nation and the manager of Tano Fuels. the First Nations First gas station, and convenience store. The business holds key importance to the community. Not only does it provide food and services to local residents who would otherwise have to drive outside the community, but it is also a significant economic driver for the local economy. Doug Olson says the arrival of TELUS Pure Fiber in 2021 has brought an end to the days of unreliable internet services that hampered business growth and innovation. Tano Fuels is now able to accommodate customers paying for services with credit and debit cards, a much anticipated convenience in a digital world.
Can I ask why you think it took so long to get childcare, for example? And do you feel that it will be one of those things that becomes a bipartisan consensus? I mean, it's not easy to set up, it's very expensive, but is it one of those things that 10 years from now we'll look back and say, why was that ever an argument? Or is it going to continue to be one of those cost pressure things in the minds of elected officials?
I think the latter, Geoff. And I mean, in the fact that we know it's hard to set up I mean, I know that it's, the policy for childcare in British Columbia has been more aggressive in the last 7 or 8 years, and it's very, very difficult for anybody to get a spot, a $10 a day spot. It's hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of historical reasons for that in British Columbia, but I think as a political issue, the problem is, unlike education, where your kid is in education for 13 years in public education, your child is in daycare for a couple, 3 maybe. And so people age out of it, and voters age out of it really fast. And what happens is people stop really caring about childcare as one of their top issues.
Well, not necessarily. I mean,
pretty quickly.
Yeah, I say this as someone who's been paying childcare fees since 2014.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many kids? Wow.
No, I have 2 kids. And the reason is because we're a 2 working family with no local, like I don't have any in-laws or my parents aren't to help. So like pretty consistently since the kids were born, we've had kids in care. And I'll say, like, shout out to Ottawa and to Victoria on this. Like, over the course of my time of having kids in care, though I never had access to $10 a day care, the cost did go down significantly. And that was very meaningful, actually, and probably had a direct corollary to how much we could put away in their RESPs, right? Like, there's all sorts of fallouts to this. And even still, I'm trying to think what my monthly bill is right now. I have a reduced bill for after school care. They're probably about to age out of it, but I need to have them there because I work until 5:30. I'm still paying about $700 a month, right? It's not, and in this context too, where my grocery bill has probably gone up easily $200 a week, just with inflation, right? Like it matters. And I hear what you're saying, that it is probably one of the hardest policy pieces there is. Like, if for a government, it's so frustrating because you can throw
Geoff
a lot
was
of
asking
money.
A little bit about the politics of it, and that, I mean, the politics of it is that's what drives the politics of it. That's why it's hard to get it done, because not enough people care about it for long enough.
Well, and then once they have it, they take it for granted.
Yeah,
I think that's a little bit what happened with full day kindergartens. A really like a good proxy for that. That said, though, I think it also shifted and became more of economic policy, just with the labor market challenges and everything else. I think the kind of brand of support is much broader than it would have been 5 years ago, even.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think it's a really good thing. It's a really good thing. But having kids costs money too, right? I mean, it's just having kids is expensive.
Oh, I noticed. Yeah.
That's what we all learn after we have one, and then some people have 2. And then some people even have 4, which I don't really.
I can't even. Yeah.
My parents did it. I decided not.
Yeah.
I want to invite you to go ahead, Mike.
No, you first, Geoff.
Well, I think it's time to discuss one of your visionary pieces, which was LNG, which at the time that I came back to Victoria, had gone very quiet, and then suddenly came alive again. And now we're close to the completion of the first big terminal in Kitimat. But also climate change and the national debate over the carbon tax, which when you were as the premier, you froze it for a period of time. What's your assessment now on both those fronts, like how all of this is unfolding? Do you feel you were well ahead of the curve on that stuff, or that there's problems to come on climate policy or energy policy? What's your take now from the perspective you're in, a few years?
Yeah. I don't see LNG and climate policy as being at odds. I mean, I think if you think of Canada as being its own little, like in a Ziploc bag of air, and we want to just, kind of control the air in our Ziploc bag, well, we're not going to meet those targets with more LNG. But if you think of us as part of a big world where we all share the air, LNG is a huge asset to try and reduce emissions in Asia, China and India in particular, where they're so dependent on thermal coal. So, and we have the access to get at them. So I think I don't think of climate policy and LNG as being, I think of them being as complementary, first of all. Then on LNG, I mean, if I look back at my accomplishments, I think it's the biggest accomplishment of my government. I mean, we spent the whole 6+ years working on it. And we got, this biggest single private sector investment in Canadian history. The LNG plant will be up and running soon, and the pipeline, and we advanced reconciliation dramatically through that process of discussing and all that. And we lost government before we got 5 up and running, 3 big ones and 2 small ones. But we certainly made an impact with that, which I think is fantastic. Now, the downside of that, though, is that the new emissions targets that have been set are going to make it impossible for the Shell Canada project to go to more than 2 trains. And what that means is that you won't see another speck of investment in LNG from foreign countries, or you'll hardly see any anyway. I mean, Western LNG is trying to get up and running, which would be fantastic, but
unless they get the power lines to electrify
if they can get power line. And so how are they going to get power lines? Well, thank goodness we got, Site C beyond the point of no return, over Premier Horgan's regret, I know at the time, but we got it there, 1,100 megawatts. That's all going to be eaten up by growing residential use. There isn't going to be any extra for a new LNG plant. So they're either going to have to change the emissions targets that we've got in place, or they will kill LNG in Canada. And, the opportunity for me isn't just to fight climate change. It's also, as a democratic nation with the best emissions profile on LNG anywhere in the world, and workers going home safe every day, and the rule of law applying, we should be supplying the world.
So changing the climate targets puts you out of step of a trajectory that scientists have said, will protect us from catastrophe. So, and if you want to kind of sit down and take a serious look at that and say, we can adjust the targets. I don't know, what does a viable path on that mean if you recognize that there's just such a huge cost the other end if you're not on track for 2050?
Well, I mean, if Canada's on track for 2050, how much of a difference are we making in fighting climate change? If we look at the goals that were set in Paris and the way that the Paris Accord was designed, and I was there at COP to talk about this kind of stuff, was we should be figuring out how countries can be encouraged to offset emissions in other countries. And so Canada's contribution, if we count the contribution that we make in offsetting thermal coal, we could cut emissions in those places coal emissions by 40% if we replace it with LNG. The Paris Agreement anticipates that we will be that will be part of the way we count our emissions. So we will more than meet our targets if we include offsets in those targets, more than meet our targets. And it only makes sense that we calculate it that way, I think, Kate, because we aren't in a Ziploc bag of air. When China's polluting the world with a devastating amount of coal-fired emissions, that's impacting all of us.
And then following that through, because I think then you're looking to, okay, we're not in a Ziploc bag of air, acknowledged. We're in a what's a global
freezer
atmospheric.
pack.
It's a freezer pack.
Freezer pack of air.
Yeah, it's a freezer pack. It's bigger than that. Then we have to have the credibility to work with international partners, right? to then collectively reduce that? And is that harder to do when we're kind of saying, no, we'll shoot past net zero by 2050, but we're going to help you get there, right? Like, how does that play out in terms of working with international partners?
Well, Canada's not meeting its emissions targets now. We've missed every growth target we've set anyway. So, I mean, I guess if credibility is a problem, we've already got that problem. But I do think that the world is more sophisticated than thinking of that as a binary thing. So I think the world would look at Canada and say, you know, the reason we designed the Paris Agreement this way is so that we can allow countries like Canada, who produce low emissions gas, for example, to be able to offset elsewhere in the world, understanding the world is just one big freezer pack of air. And
Well,
I just, you know, so I don't know if our credibility is really at stake in that. I think it's more of a domestic political question. And, you know, targets, everybody likes targets. Let's meet our targets and damn the torpedoes. And I'm just not sure that, you know, it's not actual reality. It's more of a political point. And I do think climate change deserves a good, hard, real look, because it is a catastrophe facing us. And we need to take responsibility and do everything we can to try and beat it back.
you spent a lot of time going to Asia on foreign trips when you were premier, promoting British Columbia for LNG and other things too. And that's one thing I've heard consistently since you've left office, is the impact you made representing British Columbia. What was your, I'm interested in two ways here. What was your approach when you were outselling BC and promoting these initiatives? And what were the insights you were getting back when you were representing BC abroad?
Well, you know, I was a pretty excited cheerleader for what we were doing. So, you know, I was trying to sell BC. And my approach to it was to say, look, the things that I've just talked about, right? Democratic nation, you know, all those things. But also, the amount of gas we have is unbelievable. Like, it's an unbelievably rich resource of accessible natural gas on the West Coast, some of it from ports that are the closest to Japan of any other ports in the world. I mean, it's incredible, right? We have such an opportunity there. So I would sell that opportunity to them. And, you know, I would say to them, we are going to give you certainty on your investment. So certainty around taxes, certainty around royalties, and we're going to work with you to try and develop the workforce that you need. So we'll try and understand what, you know, because we didn't know, like, how many glaziers do you need versus how many carpenters for an LNG plant that's 4 trains. We didn't know. So, you know, we said, we'll invest in our workforce, we'll invest in certainty around some of those other variables for you. And, you know, they would say to me, one of them said to me, you know, Miss Clark, I appreciate that you are really certain about the opportunity for Canada here, but I just want you to know, no one's ever going to build anything in Canada again. That was at a meeting in China. And, you know, undeterred, I went on to meet with the other guys anyway. But he was predicting something there, because even though we got the LNG, at least one LNG plant going, all the other ones, almost the other 18 that were in the pipeline for proposals got canceled. The Petronas one, which was supposed to happen, got canceled as soon as the new government came in. So, I mean, he was right that the investment climate in British Columbia and Canada is not sufficiently stable to attract enough foreign investment to do what we need to do to build our energy economy. And you see that with the foreign direct investment numbers now across the country, they're plummeting. And you can also, there is a direct correlation to that and our dropping standard of living.
So there's a reputational issue for Canada.
Yeah.
Abroad. Yeah.
I mean, there's a huge reputational issue for us to be able to say, you know, we're gonna have certainty on taxes. Well, that didn't happen. We're gonna have certainty on, you know, we're gonna make sure that the way that we govern the whole oil and gas patch is going to have certainty. Well, we didn't do that. We're going to have certainty on carbon emissions, but we didn't have that. We're going to give you certainty on everything. We don't have any of that. We didn't deliver at the end of the day after 2017. We didn't deliver on any of that. And it just puts a big chill on investment. And the problem is we started in 2011. The Americans got started after us. They looked up north and said, hey, wait a minute, we can do that too. And they built tons of LNG capacity. And that's where all the money's gone. That could
On
be
the Gulf
creating
Coast,
jobs in
yeah.
Canada.
Yeah. So you're saying like this investment's going to the States.
It is. They're also democratic. They also, send workers home safe. They do have climate goals, at least, they're not as, I don't think, diligent as we are about it, but, they're a good place to do business. Credible.
That is their climate policy, right? And Biden's IRA is sort of, whereas we're more in the place of, carbon tax, policy shifts, they're in the place of just deep investment. And I guess, is that kind of what are you making a case for that approach compared to Canada's?
Well, I mean, Texas produces more oil and gas than any state in the United States. And I'm certain than anything than Alberta does in Canada. They also have one of the biggest clean energy industries in North America. Why do they have that? Because they attract a ton of investment, energy-related investment. And when you do that, there's a ton of spin-off that they've created in the clean energy business as a result. Why has our clean energy business stumbled? Because we're not attracting investment in general.
Yeah,
and
hand in hand. Yeah. No, and I guess I'm just trying to think through, because again, like, just thinking through this morning, I'm sure you were probably following the news this morning, right? It's so much about the record-breaking weekend we had and sort of in terms of heat and the kind of predictions it has for the wildfire season. And I think the other headline today was just about, I think air quality in Canada now has kind of flipped and is worse compared to the US, because largely due to wildfires. And I think a lot of concern about the fact that this might be even worse than we anticipate because of the cumulative effect over the years of the subsequent kind of seasons we've had that have been unusually dry. And so I guess that's where, the environmental activists kind of have a lot of years, right? When they say like, we really have to be, investment really is kind of like looking for, it's gambling effectively. It's looking for the hope of a solution compared to the sort of taking accountability and restraint kind of approach that would be more of a targets, a mandates, a transition. I don't know, like, do you feel like appetite for things like a carbon tax or targets might increase as we start to have more awful wildfire seasons and more of the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, and Geoff, I apologize, I didn't answer your question about the carbon tax either. So I'll try and I'm glad you asked it, Kate. So I think here's the problem with a carbon tax. I was a big supporter of the BC carbon tax. I thought it was a beautifully designed tax. We were the only place in the country that had a carbon tax where the economy grew, and it was because we were taking all of the revenues of the carbon tax and putting it right back into the economy. All of that was going into tax cuts. So business, big business, small business, and personal income tax cuts. And so that, tax gets supercharged an economy. There's no debating that fact. So we had economic growth, and the use of the fuels covered by carbon tax in British Columbia went down. We were the only province in Canada where the use of those fuels went down. So we know that the carbon tax was effective in limiting the use of those fuels compared to the rest of the country, even as economic growth was faster than anywhere else. So we were a fantastic test case for it. The problem with the carbon tax, as my friend Dimitri has pointed out to me, is that once you have a carbon tax in place, any government afterward can come along and just like they can turn a $3 billion surplus into the biggest debt in history, they can take that carbon tax and just put it into fattening up government, which is what every government has done. So, I mean, certainly it's what happened in BC. So then you end up with, this new heavy taxation on the economy that takes money directly out of the economy and isn't really going into doing things to fight climate change anymore. And that's the problem you have with a carbon tax. Do I think that public appetite for it will grow? I don't know, because I don't think people think it's worked. I mean, like, I hear Prime Minister Trudeau talking about how, he's doing this carbon tax thing because it's hard, and what Brian Mulroney did with free trade was hard. What Brian Mulroney did with free trade was hard, and people didn't want it in 1988. But they elected him. He did it. It turned us into a $1 trillion economy for the first time. What he told us it would do happened. Justin Trudeau promised us a carbon tax. Lots of people didn't want it. Enough did. He got elected. All the things that he said it was going to do haven't happened. And so, it's like bravery is one thing, but, then bravery in the face of failure is another.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. And I think Geoff's having audio issues. Otherwise, there's like smoke coming out of his ears right now for those
I do
listening.
not see smoke coming out of his ears.
But I'll pick up on one thing, like, because I think we had Brian Yu from Central One on, chief economist at Central One, and we're talking about different types of climate policy. And I think he's not alone in sort of articulating that the beauty of the carbon tax is it's probably the most equitable way to reflect the cost of carbon emissions in the economy. And again, that you're right. I think what you said well was the devil's in the details of what government does with the revenues, but it does give you a better ability to ensure those who can bear the cost. And I think that's got to be one of the more appealing pieces of the carbon tax. I mean, is there something you would put in place of that maybe is a fairer way to account for the cost of carbon?
Well, no, I mean, I like, as I said, I think there's a lot of strong argument for a really well-designed carbon tax, and British Columbia used to have one. We led the world. We got awards from the World Bank. I remember going to, and Gordon Campbell deserves a ton of the credit for this too. It's, I remember going to COP in Paris, and we were the toast of the town for what British Columbia had accomplished. But I think there's lots of good reason to have a carbon tax. The problem is that once you have it, governments tend to abuse these things and don't do it well. And what we've ended up seeing is carbon taxes going straight into government coffers to grow government, and taking that money out of the economy altogether, putting it into government. And then government, as it grows bigger and regulations get more tangled, chokes the economy. Bigger government almost always means a smaller economy. And so you end up with this, kind of doubly terrible outcome at the end of the day. You make gas more expensive for individual people, you make government bigger, and you make the economy smaller, and their gas is still more expensive, even though it's harder for them to find a job. That's the Christy Clark circle of doom.
Our Ziploc bag full of time for this part of the discussion is bursting, but in the remaining time we do have left, if I can move over to another area of the fridge, I want to give you some time to talk about some of the causes that you've been passionate about, and I know that you've spent a lot of time over the years with Roots of Empathy, but what are things that you're plowing some of your personal time into these days?
Well, there's a group in the downtown east side of Vancouver, Mike, which you got me involved in, and I'm very grateful for that. They, and forgive me if you've already talked to listeners about this. No,
I haven't.
So they're under Providence Healthcare, but they operate as a fairly independent group. And what they do is they support pregnant women on the downtown east side of Vancouver. And I mean, try and imagine, women who are listening, what it's like to be pregnant and living in a tent in the downtown east side of Vancouver, or in a SRO it's just terrible. And many of these Indigenous women are Indigenous women. I think it's 70 or 75% of them. And many of them are living with addiction. And they told me three things when I went to see them. And I'm not going to get all of these statistics exact to the number, but there's each of them is true. One of the number one causes of women intentionally committing suicide by drug overdose in the downtown east side is because their child has been taken away by the government. Something like 90 to 95% of babies are taken away by the government from women who are pregnant and living in the downtown east side. One of the largest influxes of young people into the downtown east side are particularly young women looking for their mothers who are dead because they've committed suicide because they lost their baby. So how do we break that cycle? And if you think of it at the end of the cycle for those kids coming back, how do we make sure that they can stay with their mothers so they don't come back? And you know, my experience of being pregnant was the most hopeful experience of my life. I was going to be the greatest mother ever. I was going to clean up my act. I was going to stop drinking coffee even. I was going to be great.
Oh, you're one of those pregnant women. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it didn't last. But for those women, I mean, they're not hoping they don't drink coffee, right?
Mhm.
They're hoping they can live
Stay
clean
sober.
drugs and stay sober.
Yeah.
And so at Sheway, what we do is we help them with that, help them get sober, help them get sober enough that the government won't take their baby away, make sure that the egg marketing board, Mike got John Less, the egg marketing board, to deliver thousands of eggs that we boil and we put them in the women's pockets so that they can have them protein every day while they're pregnant. So they can have a healthy pregnancy, they can deliver a healthy baby, and in that moment of incredible hope, they can live a clean life. They can have a better chance at that, and they get to keep their baby, and their children don't come in downtown on a hopeless search for their lost mother. That to me is kind of one of those programs that can make such a difference. So I'm really involved in that, Mike. I'm doing that. So thank you for involving me with that. Recommend anybody to find out about Sheway. It's under Providence. I've done the Roots of Empathy thing. I've actually stepped away from that a little bit, but what we do is we bring little kids into classrooms with older kids as an anti-bullying strategy. And then of course I did the whole Pink Shirt Day thing in BC, and it became on when I was on radio, and it became a big national thing after the kids in Halifax did it. And that's still going. And I still think the anti-bullying, I know the current government's still working on anti-bullying stuff. It's touched a chord, and kids are all getting that education today at every school. Every teacher supports it. It's been an amazing thing. And it's way better now than it was when we first sort of introduced it here. And, governments of every stripe at every level have been a big part of that. So those are my three things, Mike.
There you go.
Those are fantastic. Both my kids participate in Pink Shirt Day, and we're training babies for Roots of Empathy. Yeah. And it was a fantastic experience. So another shout out for anyone who's got a kid coming. I think if your kids are born like May, June, I want to say, that's kind of the right timing. And look into it because it's a really rewarding experience.
It is, especially if you're a mom who's not going straight back to work, because you need to bring the baby in with you and let the kids watch the baby crawl around and meet those milestones. And when they see the kid, roll over for the first time, they're so excited, and they can't believe that this little vulnerable creature is there and how special it is. And there is just no chance that it will not evoke incredible empathy in every child in that classroom. And for a child who's been bullied and is being, harmed at home, for them to be able to feel that and get in touch with that is a huge, huge thing.
Last week, I was talking about those cold snaps, when we really need energy to keep us warm and cozy. But it's not just a matter of cranking up the thermostat. It's also about using energy more efficiently. Our sponsor, Fortis BC, recently announced it will invest a record $695.8 million to help its customers reduce their energy use over the next 4 years. It's a key pillar in the company's goal to lead the clean energy transformation in BC and reduce consumers' energy use, not to mention bringing down energy costs for consumers and businesses. Efficiency measures make a ton of difference. 740,000 tons, in fact. That's how many tons of CO2 emissions will be reduced over the life of these measures. equivalent to taking more than 228,000 passenger cars off the road. Don't worry, my car's in the garage. I walk to work. These measures are all part of FortisBC's Clean Growth Pathway to 2050 and an important contribution to helping Canada meet its pledge to double energy efficiency by 2030. Hotel Pacifico's window to the world is triple paned, and FortisBC is there to help. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I don't know whether it's a toast or a shot. I'm going to certainly take a shot after the toast at the news that the government's now offered maybe as much as $250 million to Surrey for police transition. So I guess my toast would be to Mayor Brenda Locke, and my advice would be take the money and run. It's a staggering sum.
Tough grandma. Tough grandma.
I'm not sure what's going on there. It's just thanks, folks. I'll just pour myself a drink now too.
Oh, so that was like a combined raise a glass and a shot.
Yeah, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but I do need a stiff drink.
Okay.
Well, okay. Tough grandma. Can't say that enough.
It might have been me, Mike, that it has caused Geoff to want to.
What a stiff drink.
Yeah. I don't think so.
Well, I'll go. I'll get a couple. Raise a glass. Christy, I'm not sure if you've heard this, but I saw that George Garrett passed away today. Former CKNW reporter, legendary.
Yeah.
He very gentlemanly style, but also very effective reporter that was on the air for decades. So saw that he passed, and that's definitely noteworthy for generations of people who heard his reporting on CKNW when it truly was the giant back in the day. And since you brought it up, I'll just add a glass here to Shiwei, and as Christy noted, that's a group that's down the downtown east side, and they do amazing work, and the staff there have made a huge difference in affecting the lives of both the mothers and the children. And you can never say enough good things about them, especially in the face of fentanyl crisis, which is so daunting. And they've got a plan, and they're making amazing contributions. So good for them as well.
That's awesome. I am going to raise a glass this week, and I'm going to raise a glass to Kate Graham, who is the host of one of my favorite podcasts called the No Second Chances podcast. And our guest, Christy, features fantastically in it. Really, really, it's an interesting deep dive into an interview of all the female first ministers in Canadian history. There are something like, is it 13, Christy, of some over 300 first ministers in total. It's a small number. And it's a deep dive of, Christy's on it, Kathleen's on it, Rachel Notley, Alison Redford, just like sharing some really similar experiences about what it means to be a woman in politics. And I want to raise my glass because I just want to plant a seed out there, because I was, that podcast is fantastic. Canada 2020 put it out there, but it occurs to me there's a need now, I think, to do one about first ministers, either Indigenous first ministers or maybe even just BIPOC first ministers, of which there are not many. But I think the election of Wab Kinew got me thinking and looking back to see, who there are to talk to on this. And I'm just putting it out into the universe that I would love to see that podcast, and also to folks to go check out the No Second Chances podcast and enjoy it.
After they've listened to ours.
After they listen to ours.
Well, toast. Mike McDonald told me I shouldn't do this, but I'm doing it because I'm going to his funeral on Sunday. And I think that Brian Mulroney is one of two great modern Canadian prime ministers, because he fought for free trade, which made us $1 trillion economy. And it was a very, very brave thing to do. He went out on Meech Lake, which, I protested free trade. Okay. Just telling you what I've climbed down. This has been for me to realize how incredibly good it was later in life. And he Meech Lake, worked hard at it, didn't happen. GST, made the economy more efficient. I mean, he did all this stuff that he didn't have to do that was incredibly brave to do. And I just, agree or disagree with him. And in the end of the day, I ended up agreeing with him on most things. He really was the kind of politician you want in public life, is somebody with that kind of courage. Brickbats, Kevin Falcon and John Rustad, for heaven's sakes, get your shit together. I mean, can we afford another 8 years of New Democrats? Like,
We
those
cannot
guys
afford
cannot
another
get
8
it
years of Geoff Meggs. We absolutely cannot.
I
We
mean,
need to keep him in
get
the
it
podcast
together.
studio.
Get it together.
Get it together, you guys. Honestly, they agree on way more than they disagree on, and it's going to cost the province dearly that neither of them seems at all willing to step away, step down, hold hands, do whatever they need to do to come together in a free enterprise coalition. And I think it's, from my perspective, with respect to Geoff here in particular, I think that's going to be a disaster for British Columbia.
Yeah, women
I
are
have to
better.
admit, it was a nobody's long-term plan on the NDP side.
Who saw? You didn't see it coming either, huh?
No, I didn't. That was nowhere written down at all, even thought about.
No kidding. So what's your bet for seats, Geoff?
Well, you talked about caucus management, and a lot of people like us worry about a caucus that's the size, maybe not as quite as large, but Gordon Campbell had that caucus management problem big time in 2001. And I think that if the numbers hold, there'll be a staggeringly large NDP caucus, which I suppose I should be elated about, but I'm too much of an insider to know that it's an unalloyed gift,
Turns out, though, it's a nice problem to have, because Gordon Campbell
Yeah.
won 2 majorities after that.
That's right. No, I agree. It seems very strange, but I also look around at some other jurisdictions where the numbers were great, and you
Yeah.
taught us a few things about numbers looking great. And I don't think there's any room for complacency, but on the other hand, the stubbornness of this division is something that I never would have forecast either.
Yeah, no, me neither.
All right. Well,
There
thank
you
you,
go.
Christy, for taking us to a place where I can shout out again to ask for folks to support Mike and Geoff in their need for 5-star reviews. Mike, because he did tell Christy not to make that toast to Brian Mulroney. He anticipated that was where she was going to go and told her not to, and she did not listen. Geoff, because he resents toast to Brian Mulroney and would have made it a shot. So heal
That's
their...
not true. I got it off my chest last time.
Okay, you're good now. Okay, good. Still.
I
go.
wasn't successful in life by listening to Mike McDonald, was I, Mike?
No kidding.
I thought it was the Mike McDonald government. That's what we heard. That's what Glenn Clark called it. Yeah.
Well, my dad? Were you talking to my dad?
No. Yeah, your dad.
Yeah, your dad.
Yeah, your dad.
Yeah,
Old man
surprisingly
Glenn.
young, your dad. All right. Thank you so much, Christy, for joining us today. It was fabulous having you at Hotel Pacifico. And I also want to thank our sponsors, TELUS and Fortis BC. We'll see you next week, folks. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.